the first tutorial, I explained the importance of knowing proper orientation, using orientation to acquire proper orientation, and then I discussed definitions and analogies for the arch pattern. I think now it's important to point out that if you say the term arch, you are referring to plain arch only. If you say arch, the person you are speaking with should not assume you may have meant tented arch. The tented arch is a type of an arch, but it's totally different from the arch or plain arch. Remember, in our previous tutorial, we used this exemplar of the plain arch. We used it as a comparison to questioned prints that we were trying to identify the pattern type. Keep this ridge structure in mind, this flow in mind, as we proceed onto tented arches, because right now you should have the skills to recognize plain arches and bring that along with you in this next tutorial. The tented arch is much different than what you see here in the plain arch. There are many pairs that you could put a plain arch and a tented arch together and they would look totally different. Therefore, it's not good to use the term interchangeably. If you say the word arch, you mean plain arch. If you mean to say tented arch, you must say tented arch. Let's proceed with tented arches, and I'm going to warn you that this is going to be a much more difficult observation plan for us. I've got a few things going on here in this exhibit. I have the first thing is my definition of tented arch, which is ridges flow from left to right with upthrusting ridges, angles, or partial looping ridges in the center. Many tented arches look like a camping tent. Here I'm using an analogy again to try to generalize or briefly explain what is going on with the tented arch pattern. As you examine these three exemplars, what I want you to do is concentrate on the very center of the print, not necessarily the beginning where it starts on one side and rises and returns, but more in the center of the print, here, here, and here. I'm going to bring back the plain arch, the arch that we studied earlier, and now I want you to make a comparison between this one and these three. Hopefully you can see a considerable amount of difference in how the ridge flows from left to right. In the arch here, it simply rises like a hill. But in these tented arch exemplars that I have here, there is not such a rise. There actually is some specific ridges which are rising sharply and what we call upthrusting, or an ending ridge that is stopping in space, making a point. And the reason that I call it or the reason I employ the camping tent analogy is with some imagination, you might be able to see a camping tent here. And certainly in these two here, you may be able to see one. One is quite obvious here, and this is one that I took from an actual fingerprint. And this one here is not quite adequately covered by the analogy. But again, now the tented arches are not quite as easy to generalize or explain. The next definition that I'm going to use is from the SWIGFAST Scientific Working Group on Friction Ridge Analysis, Study, and Technology. This is from their glossary. SWIGFAST describes a tented arch as a type of fingerprint pattern that possesses either an angle, an upthrust, or two of the three basic characteristics of the loop. This definition will not do too well at this point because I have not explained what a loop is, and I have just briefly mentioned upthrust, and now I'll be getting into another concept of the tented arch, and I'm going to do that by using the FBI definition. I scanned this from my personal copy of The Science of Fingerprints. This book I received while I was at training at the FBI in 1972, and you can see it's yellowed somewhat. But and this is pretty much the manual for fingerprint identification, certainly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and it's not relied upon as much now, although it's still accurate. Let's see what the FBI says about the tented arch. In the tented arch, most of the ridges enter upon one side of the impression and flow or tend to flow upon the other side, as in the plain arch type. However, the ridges or ridge at the center do not. There are three types of tented arches. The type in which ridges at the center form a definite angle, 90 degrees or less. The type in which one or more ridges at the center form an upthrust. An upthrust is an ending ridge of any length rising at a sufficient degree from the horizontal plane, 45 degrees or more. Or the type approaching the loop type, possessing two of the basic or essential characteristics of the loop, but lacking the third. In the FBI's first section of their definition, they refer to ridges that form a definite angle, 90 degrees or less. And if you look at example number 122, 123, and 124, I think you can see the angle that they're talking about. And this is a nice right angle here. If you follow this one right here. And if you follow this line here, this appears to have a pointed angle right here. Dropping down, this one is squared off, and the angle is right here. So these three fall under the explanation of an angle in the print, which would make it a tented arch. If you go back to my analogy of riding the bike from left to right without getting a flat tire, my analogy included that possibly these points on the tented arch could cause a flat to the tire, especially this one right here that's stopping in space. That's why I added the flat tire analogy to that, because of the angle and the possibility of a point being there. The FBI definition also gets into the description of an upthrust, and an upthrust is an ending ridge which rises at a sufficient degree from the horizontal plane, 45 degrees or more. And this would be an example of an upthrust, this point. Also, these are upthrusting ridges here, where they are coming straight up in the air. Another example would be this one in the very center. And now these that are in the FBI definition clearly fit my analogy of the camping tent. Here in my observation, these two ending ridges here, they would make this a tented arch, certainly in my analogy, because this could give your tire a flat, and also because it refers to an upthrust or an ending ridge in space. The mention of the loop would be this pattern here, where we have a ridge that is starting from one side, it's turning curving, actually recurving and returning back. However, it does not have the other components of a loop, so this would still be a tented arch. And again, it's a little bit more difficult because you do not know the definition of a loop yet, and it will become clearer as we get to that pattern. Now let's look at a few more exemplars of tented arch and try to see which of the pattern interpretations and definitions we would use. In this one here, I think you would employ the angle definition mentioned by the FBI, in that if you follow this ridge, it abuts this one and it makes what appears to be a right angle. This would be a tented arch. This one in the center is clearly along the lines of my camping tent analogy, where you would have the top of the tent here, and the tent poles would be coming up in the very center. Same way with this one here. This clearly looks like a camping tent. I'll move down to here, and again, the FBI mentioned the upthrusting ridge in the very center, which is this, and it also has the configuration of a camping tent. And this one again is the camping tent, and if you look at this one, you can see I accidentally put it in twice, and hopefully even at this point you know that these two prints actually came from the same finger, and that was just a duplicate, and that is a plain arch. Let's revisit, however, the plain arch, or the arch that we studied, and let's just bring that one back in here and put them side by side. There's the tented arch, there's the plain arch. Let's move this over. There's the plain arch, and there's the tented arch. And hopefully you were doing this in the previous exercise when we were trying to find the arches. Again, this comparison should be easier for you now as we progress. But again, you're looking just in the center area. To further expand on the tented arch explanation and definition, I'm going to go back to the drawing board and let me just run a few ridges by for you to look at. Let's begin with ridges that rise in the center, return back to approximately the same level. Let's try another one here. And at this point, it could possibly be that this would be a plain arch pattern, as the ridges from the tip area have this rather gentle approach or elevation here. And I'm just going to add a few more here. And let's also put in, remember those ridges that were by the crease? Let's put a few of those in there. Now I really want to explain the difference between the plain arch and the tented arch. And you're going to see some very important ridges that come in. And now I'm referring to the FBI introduced the concept of an upthrusting ridge. And this is one that comes in on an angle and stops here. And let's bring another one. And let's bring it over. And we can bring that down. And then we'll bring one more up here. And now we have basically of course, the tent formation. And this is what you will see in a tented arch. Let's just go backwards and let me try to explain that angle definition component. And that is, a ridge is coming up and it's going returning back down, and we have another ridge that is coming up this way, and it is striking this ridge at an angle, and this is a sharp angle here, and so now this is the angle formation that they're talking about, and there could also be an upthrusting ridge here. So this is where the angle comes in. I could put one here too. Now the third thing, and that is the looping formation. And this is going to be a little bit more difficult for you to understand because we haven't talked about completely what a loop is. And this would be an example that this would be a looping formation here. I'm following this around again. But because this ridge is coming up with this and joining here, that would not be considered a loop. It would be still considered a tented arch. Let's just go back a little bit more and get back to my camping tent analogy. And that is, of course, this tent pole in the center. And the tent pole is another way of saying an upthrusting ridge. And this can have a cap on it here. It can come all the way around. That didn't turn out as good as I'd like it to, but I think that illustrates the camping tent analogy. Before we do an exercise, let me just review one more time my definition and analogy for the tented arch. And while I'm saying that, of course, compare these tented arches to the plain arch here. Tented arch ridges flow from left to right with upthrusting ridges, angles, or partial looping ridges in the center. Many tented arches look like a camping tent. Here's what we're going to do in this comparison. The first thing is I have indicated with a blue box the exemplars for the tented arch. So you will look at these exemplars as I fly in the other prints. The other thing I want you to remember, and that is I want you to consider the plain arch again. And if I fly in a plain arch, hopefully you'll be able to recognize it and then eliminate the tented arch. At this point, I'm going to be bringing in the prints, and I'm asking you to recognize the tented arch, and then secondarily, if you can recognize the plain arch, that would be good. And this will prepare you for your assignments. Let's bring in the first print. Is that a tented arch? That one may be difficult. What about this one? Is this a tented arch? What about this one? Is that a tented arch? What about this one? What about this one? Is this a tented arch? Hopefully you have a good reference on that one. Please tell me immediately you know that this is not a tented arch. What about this one? And you know, at this point, you should be wondering if you're going to be able to recognize the other patterns, and that's the good thing about going over these multiple times. Is that a tented arch, or is it a plain arch, or is it neither? What about this one? Is that a tented arch? Hint, hint. What about that one? Let's follow the ridges. What about this one? Tented arch, or plain arch, or neither? What about this one? What you should be doing with your eyes is following them, and especially as they go from left to right or right to left, and seeing what they do. I mentioned something about a loop previously, and maybe you can recognize that. But is this a tented arch? Is it a plain arch, or is it neither? What about this one? And here I mentioned earlier that we will have to look at specific ridge paths. And I want you to I want to draw your attention to this right in here in the very center, and be looking for the white space there. You'll see that print again, I promise you. What about this one? You may have questions about that. What about that? Tented arch, plain arch, or neither? Tented arch. What about this one? Tented arch, or plain arch? What about this one? I hope you're recognizing something here that you haven't seen too much of, and what is going on here is quite remarkable. Certainly nothing like in the plain arch, and hopefully you recognize that that is not consistent with the tented arch. This one is interesting, especially if you consider what you were seeing. If I did this to it, that might change your mind somewhat. But remember, sometimes you have to look at the entire print, and sometimes you have to look specifically at a ridge path. And in this case, you must look at the entire print and make your determination. We'll revisit that again. What about this one? Let's try this. That's interesting there, isn't it? Okay. What about this one? Tented arch, plain arch? What about that one? What about that one? I told you I wasn't going to bring any in in the wrong orientation, I hope you recognized that this was the crease area and that you also knew that the pattern flow was wrong. And I'm just going to spin it around. And maybe you remember this from the previous exercise. Let me just quickly review, and remember I told you that it was going to be more difficult to recognize tented arches than it was the plain arch. And importantly, if you say the word arch, you are referring to this pattern, the plain arch, and not this, even though this is considered a tented arch. What we used to use, the term A's and T's at the FBI. An A would refer to a plain arch, or the arch pattern here, and the T would refer to a camping tent, or the tent here. We went over the analogy that I employed using the camping tent, and I have these little lines drawn in here like it is the tent pole. I also went over the Swigfast definition of tented arch and made an exhibit, or showed a print of that. And then probably the most revealing, or the most important, and certainly the most accurate, was the science of fingerprint terminology that I went over. And this is the manual that was actually used for Henry classification. And I tried to discuss and explain the upthrusts and the angles of tented arches. And then the last thing we did was we used these exemplars as tented arches, and we did a number of comparisons of question patterns, and we also tried to recognize the plain arch again, which gave us another opportunity for that. In this process, we have covered both plain arches and tented arches, and you're building up your directory of information about fingerprint patterns. The next phase of this program, you will get your tented arch recognition guide, and you'll be able to study it as it indicates the analogies and the definitions along with the exemplars. And the next thing that you'll do is, like in the arch quiz, you will take a quiz of 50 exemplars and try to find the tented arch pattern in this array. After you're completed with that, you will review a video and see which of the patterns are tented arches and plain arches. As in the other exercise, just designate the tented arch with a T, and then you'll be able to watch your video for the answers.